This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. We are joined today by none other than winemaker Jordan Harris, who is joining us all the way from the Finger Lakes and that historied vineyard, historied all the way back to 1977, that is, Heron Hill. How are you today, Jordan?
Very good, thank you, Jimmy. How are yourself?
Fantastic, fantastic. Enjoying some spring weather. I hope you are doing the same.
Yeah, it was kind of rainy the past couple of days, but the sun's coming back out. We're supposed to have a fabulous weekend.
I've heard that actually, for here anyway. Now, you have some roots in Niagara. You were a student of Niagara College. How did you get from Niagara College to where you are today?
Kind of convoluted sort of way. So started at Niagara College. That was the second class there for the wine and vit program. I kind of, worked my way around in Niagara briefly. Was a winemaker at Niagara College upon graduating as Jim Warren was retiring, and then moved over to work with Sue Ann, staff over at 20 Bs when they were still Niagara Vintners Incorporated. And, just got pretty involved into the industry there as well through, different competitions and, working with a couple small wineries. But in 2007, honestly, it was my wife and I were just getting married, and my wife had just finished working over in Margaret River and the Great Southern over at Goundry as part of Constellation. And so she came back, and we thought, we should just go and travel around and, make wine in different places. And the first place that we stopped was in Virginia in 2007. I just thought we'd be there for 6 months, and 13 years later, we moved to the Finger Lakes. It was just one of those things where life happened. We were enjoying ourselves, and then children and everything. And then come full circle, then we decided, since we have children and COVID hit, while working in Niagara, I always had that sort of grass is greener on the other side sort of feeling, young and funny. And so I always loved the idea of the Finger Lakes as well. So then there was this opportunity that sort of popped up, and it was just everything came in line where I thought, this is the chance to go make wine in that place where I said I always wanted to try making wine. It happened to be at one of the most storied wineries in the Finger Lakes and one of the oldest vineyards. And got us closer to home. So everything just kind of lined up and said, let's do this. So in July 2020, found myself in the Finger Lakes, making wine here at Heron Hill.
So for those people unfamiliar with Heron Hill, however few people those are, Heron Hill is, as you said, one of the most historied vineyards and winemaking operations within the Finger Lakes. Would you mind giving us a potted history of that?
Yeah, of course. So it actually started with John and Joe Ingle planting their vineyard. They just, quite frankly, they wanted to raise their kids on an organic farm. That's how it all sort of started. So they decided to start off by planting grapes on this farm in 1972. So we actually have our 50th anniversary of the vineyard this year. Which is kind of exciting. So we have some really old vines to work with based on Ingle Vineyard being our main spot. Most of the vines were planted through the 70s and 80s, but John quickly found out that, the big players in the Finger Lakes here at the time, they were real big players. This was, the start of kind of the Constellation, and you had Taylor Wine Company and the big guys. What he was finding is that there was no money to be made in selling grapes to a lot of these large wineries, particularly since he did as everyone told him not to do. He was told specifically, you cannot plant vinifera. And he turned around and said, well, forget it. So he was one of the first to, say, I'm going against the grain, and planted Riesling. And since his vineyard's 100% vinifera, he did plant Saval to start with as well to kind of hedge his bets. And for 40 years, he was waiting for the world to jump on the bandwagon of Saval until he finally gave up and said, you know what? I don't think this bandwagon is happening.
Next year.
Yeah. So, but the reason kind of gone through, but he just couldn't get money. And he thought, maybe we just need to make our own. So 77, they started up Heron Hill Winery, which is just meant to be, a small winery that he could, turn his fruit from his farm into wine, and had no real huge ambitions for it to turn out the way that it did, and get the size and distribution that we do. So yeah, I mean, it was kind of on a whim that he just, again, wanted to be this little organic farm that he could raise his kids on. He's always been a huge believer in sustainability and organics, and pushing that forth. So that was the driving factor behind the whole thing. And it's just had great success. So we've been pretty lucky that John has kind of invested in the same theory and idea of what Heron Hill is from day one, almost going up on 50 years. So.
Cheval Blanc aside, Riesling is your flagship variety there, right? What else do you have in the ground?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're talking to me, I'm going to tell you Riesling is our flagship, but it's kind of funny. Joe Ingle doesn't really enjoy Riesling all that much. Okay. John is a fan, but his wife, they've decided that the flagship of what they want is actually a toss-up between Chardonnay and Blaufränkisch.
Interesting.
They're huge fans of the Chardonnay that we're growing here, and I am as well. But I mean, obviously, Riesling is sort of the stay true grape for the Finger Lakes. But the Chardonnay, particularly on a minimal oak, if any oak style, it's steely, it's fresh, it's bright. But we also have a lot of ripeness here that works out well. So. The Chardonnay shows really well, and then the Blaufränkisch, that's newer to us. So we had used fruit from a couple of different vineyards around the Finger Lakes for a few years, but John planted it in 2013, and it's just, I mean, it's one of the just great successes within the vineyard. I mean, this year in particular, I just finished walking through the vineyard with John, and we had a pretty harsh couple of weeks at the start of January this winter that did some damage, but the Blaufränkisch is just coming along. And that was the one part that we didn't know, is how it was going to stand up to the cold. But we can get, fabulous ripe characteristics from the Blaufränkisch, ripe and round, but still has that Finger Lakes linear aspect to it, preserving acidity, but without, having any of the underripe sort of caraway seed, black pepper of Blaufränkisch. I mean, it's all fruit and really good structured. So I would say that those are Chardonnay and Blaufränkisch are the other two big flagships to us, but we also do Pinot Noir. I would really push on Pinot Noir as a flagship, but that's always that grower meets winemaker battle. The grower does not want Pinot Noir, whereas the winemaker says, that's how I'm going to make a name for myself, is I have to make the best Pinot Noir on the planet. And I do love the Pinot Noir from here, just the cooler climate, and having just worked in a warmer climate for 13 years, it was nice to get back to that. And then because, in the Finger Lakes, Cabernet Franc is a big thing. So, and Cabernet Franc is also, a pretty substantial part of what we do, both at the Ingle Vineyard and our Cuca site here. But then John, just for the sake of fun and just to go against the grain, does have Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon also planted. Cabernet Sauvignon, in the years that it does well, 2020 was a great year. It's pretty spectacular.
I think the key phrase there is in the years.
Yes, 100%. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, he only has an acre of it planted. It's more just kind of as a fun thing. So in those good years, we can be pretty excited about it. And Merlot does well with our growing seasons. It just, much like Niagara, it does not like our winters. So it's a little bit sporadic, but when we do have the fruit there, I mean, Merlot can do really well.
I hear you. Now, getting back to Blaufränkisch, it's the New York show in Toronto next week, and Heron Hill are showing a couple of wines, the 2020 Ingle Vineyard Riesling and the 2019 Blaufränkisch. Let's start off with the Blaufränkisch and try and dial in what people should be tasting in that glass and what brings that to the glass. I'm curious as to the soil that you grow your Blaufränkisch on.
Yeah. So the Blaufränkisch, for that bottling, it's actually from two different vineyards. There's the one vineyard, which being John's vineyard, and it's a really kind of gravelly, it's the Howard gravelly loam. So I mean, it's a really well drained topsoil, and then like most soils here, leads into shale and then some sandstone. John's site, it is one of the very few partially south-facing slopes in the Finger Lakes. Almost all of our vineyards are either east or west facing because the lake's running north-south. But John's site on Canandaigua Lake, it has a little bit of a point in which he sticks out into the lake, and so we get a southeast-facing exposure there. The other site for the Blaufränkisch is actually Matt Doyle's Kaywood Farm, which is on the east side of Seneca Lake, which is what's in what, I mean, a lot of people here, they call it the banana belt because it's the deepest part of the lake. So it's very well moderated. And it's also, being on the east side, it's a pretty steep west facing slope. So it gets a lot of that afternoon sunlight. So for the either later ripeners or warmer varieties that we want, it could just create this richness and power. There's a little bit more clay over there, so I find that the fruit coming from there, it tends to be more fruit driven as opposed to that linear and mineral component that we also get out of Ingle Vineyard. But at the same time, having that viscosity and richness from that afternoon sunlight or from the south exposure over at Ingle. So they really complement each other well, getting that sort of saline, mineral, flinty element out of a lot of fruit from the Ingle site, as well as that warmer, viscous, richer fruit coming out of the Kaywood site. That said, 2019 was a fairly cool year as well, which is great. I mean, that's what Finger Lakes is oftentimes about. It's a fairly long growing season, but fairly cool growing season. So it's all behaving in that medium body frame. It's not a heavy wine by any means. It is still something that is elegant and can work its way through a meal. It's true to Finger Lakes form, and also with that kind of electric acidity that we get excited about.
Do you give it any oak treatment at all?
Yeah, so I mean, it's all neutral oak. So I mean, the barrels are anywhere between 4 and 8 years old, but it does all go into 225 French oak. I mean, although it is neutral, so it doesn't really show that much of that character. It's all mostly just about for the settling and a little bit of lees contact. Is the main reason that's there, and then that micro-oxygenation that happens. So it'll sit in barrel for 10 months. I find that if we're going any further than that on Blaufränkisch, we start to dry out some of the fruits. The tannins are there, but they're not massive, so it doesn't require as much time to sort of integrate.
Yeah. And as for the Riesling, you said it's one of your favorite wines that you've made there. The 2020 Ingle Vineyard. So this is one of the oldest vineyards, if not the oldest, in the Finger Lakes, right?
Well, it wouldn't be the oldest. I mean, Dr. Frank down the street from us would probably have something to say if I started touting that we're a little bit old, but and they're just a couple miles away from us. But it is one of the older vineyards for sure. And the Ingle Vineyard bottlings were talked about as being one of the first, if not the first, single vineyard bottlings that were happening. Now, obviously, the 2020 is not that. But yeah, so we started planting in 1972 over at Ingle Vineyard, and the youngest vines that are at the Ingle Vineyard are planted in 2004. We've got 5 main blocks within the Ingle Vineyard of Riesling that play very differently from each other. They're not necessarily going to be in Toronto for the tasting, but we actually did in 2020, we also did a small lot from each individual blocks. We actually have our 5 blocks Riesling, and then this is the blend of what those would be. But we have, there's sort of a mixture of soils, because there is a small amount as we get further away from the lake that it starts to become more clay driven. It's still not, I mean, it's a hard clay. I mean, it's a silt loam, still with that underlaying shale and sandstone. But then there's also, we have the gravelly areas, and we have some steeper slopes and some a little bit flatter. And then we have right behind our one tasting room that's over there is our flattest spot, but it's also very windy. So it creates a good moderation and cooling temperature. Overall, what I find with the Ingle Vineyard wines, though, is we get a long hang time from that wind and because of having that south and east facing exposure, we dry out early in the morning, so we can really prolong the harvest, particularly for Riesling, while maintaining that electric, powerful acidity.
Right.
And it's one of the cooler sites being over on Canandaigua Lake as opposed to the bigger sites being on Cayuga and Seneca when you think of the Finger Lakes. And that cooler site, it just works out well for extending that growing season. We very seldom get an early frost there, so we can kind of prolong it out, mostly be due to the wind factor that we get off of those sites. So the wine itself, I mean, it plays well. It gets this really lovely kind of stone fruit peach characteristic, but still in some of the cooler areas like the tasting room block, it sits more on that citrus fruits, lemon and lime, and then there's this kind of gingery component. So it creates this complex blend that we get really excited about, all held together with this really racy acidity. And in a year like 2020, which was quite warm, so the opposite of 2019 that we were talking about, it was quite warm, particularly during the days, but then it would cool down a lot at night because we never had any clouds really, so we weren't creating greenhouse effect at all. So there was huge diurnal temperature swings, so we were getting really ripe flavors and good viscosity, but still maintaining that freshness. So yeah, it's just made for a wine that I think is one of the most exciting wines that I've tasted around, that I'm pretty pumped about. And it was one of those years that when we talk about minimal intervention, I mean, every winemaker wants to say that they're non-intervention and so on and so forth, but then, there comes years where all of a sudden you step back and say, well, I also have to make sure that this wine tastes good. Yeah. And so there are years where, I've stepped in, but 2020 was certainly not one of those years that we had to step in. The fruit was just perfectly clean. Chemistry wise, everything came in as you want. So, I mean, most of the fruit for the Riesling was coming in right around that 20 to 21 brick level. And that's perfect for me. I don't want the Riesling to get too out of hand. So the Ingle Vineyard from 2020 sits at 11.5% alcohol. With also that piercing acid, but it's got just shy of 1% residual sugar or so. Right. Since we're talking in Canada, I can actually use metric, so we're at 9 grams per liter.
There you go.
Yeah, perfect. It's funny when I talk grams per liter here. Something, what are you talking about percentage? What are you talking about? It just created a very balanced wine where we could stand back and we just didn't need to do anything in the cellar. It was all about expressing that site, and it expressed well.
Now, is the Ingle Vineyard, when it comes to Riesling, monoclonal or a variety of clones?
I'm going to say it's a variety of clones, but I'll be completely honest with you, we have no idea.
Oh, right. Okay.
So, in most of the Finger Lakes wines, I mean, when you were planting grapes in the 70s and 80s, you weren't planting based on clones. You were calling a nursery like, so do you have some Riesling we can get?
Material you could get your hands on.
And it was whatever came to us. So we do have one clone that we've essentially named ourselves, and it was just the people in which John purchased this one block from did already have some Riesling on it when they purchased it for where the tasting room is. And he said, this block here, we bought it as a different clone and it'll last through any winter. So it was called the Arctic clone. I don't think there's actually such a thing as the Arctic clone, but we call it that because it can kind of weather itself through and it doesn't really get tampered by winters. And it does show different characteristics. It tends to be a little bit even more racy than the other clone that's right beside it.
Oh, right.
What it is, I have no idea. I don't know the clones.
The Arctic clone, right. In closing, you also have another wine in our market right now, the 2017 Pinot Noir Reserve.
Sure.
Speaking to that for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that gets into the, that battle of grower versus winemaker relationship. And, Pinot Noir, we get excited whenever there's a great Pinot Noir that's out there as winemakers, even though the growers, I find that the growers, they get frustrated even when it is fabulous. They say, I don't care. It was just too much work. I don't want to do it again. But yeah, the 2017 vintage it was a plentiful vintage, but it was also quite warm and it was dry for the harvest season in particular. There was some rain early on, which just kind of pushed the season along so that it was able to prolong. And with the Pinot Noir, that one was hanging into October, which is pretty late for us to be able to push Pinot Noir. But it really kind of it helped the flavor development kind of get there. And because it was such a large yield in 2017, and we did end up getting to a point where we were able to ripen everything, it still kept everything a little bit leaner. So I find that it's that kind of old worldy sort of styled of Pinot Noir. It shows that sort of clovey beetroot characteristic with some of that red fruit, raspberry floral. As far as the winemaking is concerned, it's pretty consistent with a lot of the Pinot Noir. So we'll sit around 15% new oak. And then the rest will be second, third, and even some neutral barrels that go into the Pinot Noir. And it also sits for around 10 months, typically, for our Pinot Noir program. We don't want to push it too far. I mean, there will be years where we feel like it can over vintage, certainly. Right. But for the most part, it'll go on that 10-month sort of frame so that we don't dry out the elegant fruit which we get from our Pinot Noir here. Pinot Noirs, people that are looking for, that you taste a lot of Riesling and Pinot Noir from Niagara as well. The difference I find is the Pinot Noirs here, and including the 2017 Reserve, it's a little bit more on that angular component. So structurally, component-wise, a touch more acidity and a touch more tannin than what you'd be used to, say, from some of the areas around Niagara. And it gives, you obviously get mineral components from a lot of Niagara Pinot or Prince Edward County Pinot, but it's just got this really kind of ripe fruit and floral, but meets that mineral component. So it's kind of exciting. I would love to one day just do a tasting. I don't know why I haven't done it yet. Taking some County Niagara and Finger Lakes, fruit like Pinot Noir and seeing the differences would be kind of fun.
Now, the challenges with Pinot would be quite similar in Finger Lakes as to Niagara, right?
Yeah. So, I guess the big difference though would be in the Finger Lakes, you're really going to have to go place to place as opposed to a Niagara, because you've got that whole peninsula that is mostly the same facing direction. You've got, a lot of east and some north sort of facing. Here, it's all about where you're situated on the lake. So I would argue that on the east side of the lakes, Pinot is going to struggle a little bit more just because of that hot afternoon sunlight. And being shaded throughout the mornings. So Pinot with those tight clusters and really trying to, pull it through, you need to get that morning sunlight to kind of dry out the clusters so we don't have breakdown early on. So I think here, it's largely about planting on the west side of the lakes. We have that east facing slope and in some of the cooler areas.
Excellent. Well, Jordan, thank you very much for joining us at Good Food Revolution today. We've managed to pack in quite a lot of information into the last 20 or so minutes. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll see you here in Ontario, perhaps next week, perhaps further down the line.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Take care for now.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.